The late afternoon sun burned low over the horizon, turning the prairie sky into a wash of copper and gold. Dust swirled on the main road into the small frontier town, clinging to boots, skirts, and wagon wheels. The townsfolk were finishing their day's business. Doors shuttered, animals driven back to pens, merchants closing shop. No one paid much attention to the thin figure stumbling out of the prairie grass and into the town's edge. She was little more than a shadow of herself. Her dress, once pale blue, hung in tatters, the hem frayed and dark with mud. Her boots were cracked, the soles nearly gone. Her hair, unkempt and dulled by days without washing, fell in loose strands around her hollow face. Yet it was not her clothes that drew the glance of one rancher standing outside the feed store. It was her eyes. They were wide, sunken, and desperate. The kind of eyes that carried both hunger and shame. She paused on the street corner, watching people pass. A mother pulled her child a little closer. A shopkeeper frowned and turned away. Whispers started, the way they always did when someone strange appeared in town. Her stomach growled so loud she pressed a trembling hand against it, as though to quiet the sound. She had not eaten properly in days, living on scraps, berries from roadside bushes, stale crusts begged off travelers who threw them at her like she was less than human. Now, as the smell of baking bread drifted from the town's only bakery, her legs nearly buckled. Driven by desperation, she stepped forward, her eyes scanning for anyone who might give her a crust. And there he was, the rancher. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and calloused hands. His hat shaded his steady eyes, and he leaned against the post outside the feed store, studying her with something rare. Not suspicion, not disdain, but quiet concern. She swallowed hard and approached him, her breath uneven. "Sir," her voice cracked like a dry twig. I need bread." The rancher straightened, his expression softening. He waited for her to continue, not rushing her, though her every word cost her dignity. Her lips trembled. She looked at his boots, not his face. "I have nothing else. Nothing but myself. I'll give myself for bread." The words spilled out in a whisper so low only he could hear them. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. In her world, it had come to this. Her body was the only currency left. For a moment, the silence was heavier than the dry summer air. She braced herself for laughter, for cruelty, for the kind of mocking bargain men had made before. She expected him to smirk, to seize upon her shame, to say yes in that greedy, triumphant way she had seen in others. Instead, the rancher's jaw tightened and his eyes, clear, unwavering, met hers. "No!" The single word made her flinch. Her throat closed with panic, and tears threatened. She had gambled what little dignity remained and lost. But before she could stagger away, he spoke again, his voice steady but kind. "I don't trade bread for flesh," he said. "You're worth more than that." She blinked, stunned. The words didn't make sense at first. Worth more? She had been told her worth was only what men could take. Yet his tone carried no cruelty, no mockery, only truth. Her knees nearly gave out. The rancher caught her elbow, steadying her, then gestured toward the road out of town. "Come with me. You'll eat, not because of what you give, but because you're human. That's reason enough." And for the first time in months, hope flickered in the hollow place where hunger had lived too long. The woman froze at his words, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Men had always taken what they wanted. They never offered kindness freely. His refusal should have cut like a knife, yet instead it was lined with dignity. He hadn't spat at her. He hadn't mocked her. He hadn't looked at her as if she were something rotten. Still, she couldn't believe him. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Don't lie to me, sir. I know what I am. I know what I've become. You don't have to pretend with me. Just, if you give me bread, I'll do what you want. No one will know." The rancher's brows knit together, a shadow of grief passing over his rugged face. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear, though the street behind them buzzed with gossiping onlookers. "Listen to me," he said firmly, yet without harshness. "I won't take you like that. I won't let you sell yourself for a meal. You're not a thing to be bought. You hear me? You're a woman, a human being, and I see you as more than the hunger that brought you here." She shook her head in disbelief. "But I have nothing to give you." The rancher's lips pressed into a line. "That's where you're wrong. You've got breath in your body, life in your eyes, and a soul worth more than you know. You don't need to give me anything. A man ought to feed the hungry, not trade on their desperation." The words landed heavy in her chest. They didn't sound like the empty kindness some men used as a trap. They sounded true, steady, unshakable, like the earth beneath her bare, blistered feet. But shame burned hotter than the sun above. She pulled back, hugging her thin arms around herself. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered. "To be turned away again and again. To have people look at you like you're dirt, less than dirt. I thought, maybe if I offered myself, someone would see some worth in me." The rancher's jaw clenched and his gaze softened. He had seen suffering before, his own and others, but it tore at him to hear her speak so low of herself. He lowered his hat, shielding her from the stares of curious townsfolk, and said, "Don't mistake cruelty for truth. The way they treated you doesn't decide your worth, and you'll never have to prove it to me by hurting yourself." Her breath caught. No one had ever said such words to her. Still, her hunger was a gnawing ache that threatened to drag her back into despair. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Then why? Why would you help me?" He looked past her for a moment, his gaze stretching out over the dusty street and beyond, toward the open plains. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight deeper than kindness alone. "Because once, someone helped me when I thought I was lost. Because I know what it means to go hungry, not just for food, but for hope. And because," he paused, meeting her eyes steadily, "no one should have to beg for bread with their body. Not while I'm standing here." The tears finally fell, hot and unbidden, carving clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. For the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her chest that was not hunger or fear. It was something like relief. He tipped his hat toward the road. "Come on, you'll have a meal. You'll have rest. Not because you've earned it, and not because I expect anything in return. Simply because you need it, and that's enough for me." She hesitated, the old voice of doubt whispering that it couldn't be true. But as her legs wavered beneath her, she found herself leaning toward his strength, her body betraying what her heart longed to believe. And so, with a step that felt both terrifying and freeing, she followed him away from the town's judgmental eyes, toward something she didn't yet dare to name: mercy. The road out of town stretched quiet and lonely, the dust kicking up behind their steps. The young woman followed the rancher at a hesitant pace, half expecting him to change his mind, to reveal some hidden cruelty once they were beyond the eyes of the townsfolk. But he walked steadily ahead, not once glancing back to leer or taunt, only slowing his long strides so she could keep up. After a while, his ranch came into view, a wide spread of land bordered by split-rail fencing, with horses grazing in the fields and cattle moving slow and steady in the distance. A weathered house stood at the center, its white paint faded by years of sun, but strong and upright like the man who called it home. To her weary eyes, it looked like a fortress. Her stomach twisted tighter the moment they stepped onto the porch. The air carried a warm, savory smell drifting from the chimney, meat simmering, bread baking. Her knees nearly gave out. She pressed a hand against the railing, swaying, but the rancher noticed and steadied her with a hand beneath her elbow. "You'll be all right," he said quietly. "Just a few more steps." Inside, the house was simple, sturdy, and clean. The wooden table stood ready with 2 plates, as if he had been expecting company all along. He pulled out a chair for her. She hesitated, trembling fingers hovering over the backrest. But the smell of food was too strong, too overwhelming. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair. The rancher moved with quiet efficiency, ladling stew from a pot into a bowl. He set it before her, then placed a thick slice of bread beside it, golden brown, its crust still warm from the oven. For a moment, she only stared. It seemed too much, too generous, almost cruel in its kindness. She had imagined gnawing on stale crumbs, not being handed a real meal like a guest. "Go on," he urged gently, taking his own seat but not touching his food. He waited for her to begin. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon. The first bite of stew hit her tongue, rich with potatoes, carrots, and tender beef. Tears blurred her vision instantly. She tried to blink them back, but they fell anyway, dropping into the bowl. "Slow," he said softly, watching her eat as though he were guarding her. "Take it easy. Your body's not used to much." She nodded, forcing herself to eat smaller spoonfuls. Each bite was agony and relief all at once, the aching hunger fighting the body's weakness. She chewed the bread slowly, savoring its softness, its warmth, something she thought she might never taste again. As she ate, her mind raced. Why was he doing this? Why treat her with such care when she had offered him something shameful? Thought made her throat tighten, but when she dared glance up, she saw no judgment in his face. He wasn't watching her with lust or amusement. He was simply making sure she didn't collapse. When at last the bowl was empty, she sat back, exhausted. It was not just her stomach that felt full. It was something deeper, something inside. Her had been starved longer than her body, and now, for the first time in months, it had been fed. She whispered, her voice hoarse. "Thank you." The rancher gave a small nod, as though thanks were unnecessary. "A hungry person needs food. That's all there is to it." But she knew there was more to it. This wasn't just about food. It was about being treated as a person, not as a bargain. She lowered her gaze to the empty bowl, fighting fresh tears. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, and though she didn't dare believe it yet, she felt safe. The stew bowl sat empty before her, the bread nothing more than crumbs on the plate. She leaned back in the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though afraid that even resting them on the table might be taking too much. The warmth of food in her belly gave her strength, but it also uncovered another weight, the heavy silence between her and the rancher. He had been patient while she ate, sipping water, not pressing her for words. But now, as the fire popped in the hearth and the last streaks of daylight slipped through the window, he looked at her with steady, unhurried eyes. "Do you have a name?" he asked simply. The question startled her. For weeks, perhaps months, she had been nothing more than girl, stray, or worse. No one had asked her name. No one had cared. Her lips parted, but the word caught in her throat. Saying it felt dangerous, as if speaking it aloud would make her real again, and reality had been cruel. She swallowed, her fingers twisting in her lap. At last, in a voice barely louder than the fire's crackle, she said, "Clara." The rancher nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting a truth. "Clara," he repeated, giving the name back to her with weight, with respect. "It suits you." She blinked at him, stunned. No one had ever said that. No one had treated her name like it mattered. "Where are you from, Clara?" he asked gently. Her chest tightened. She wanted to lie, to keep her shame buried. But something in his tone, calm, unjudging, opened the door she had kept locked. "My father had a farm," she began, staring at her hands. "South of here, near the river. It was small, but it was ours. The land was good until the rains stopped. Then the drought came. First the crops failed. Then the animals died one by one. Debt collectors came next. They took the land, the house, even the plow horse." Her voice cracked. She had tried not to remember, but the images rose sharp and merciless. The empty fields, her father's stooped shoulders, her mother's hollow face. "When there was nothing left," she whispered, "my parents sent me away, Said maybe I could find work. Said I was young, I could survive better than they could. She bit her lip, tasting salt. But there was no work. Only hands that grabbed and voices that mocked. I begged for food, and most times they just laughed. A few... Her words broke off, her cheeks burning with shame. A few made their price clear. The rancher's hands tightened around his cup, but he said nothing. His silence was not dismissive, it was heavy with anger, though not at her. I kept walking, Clara finished weakly, town to town, always hungry, always cold. I thought, maybe if I offered myself, someone would finally give me what I needed. That's why I said what I said to you. It was the only way I knew how to ask. Her confession hung in the air like smoke, bitter and stinging. Clara braced herself for his disgust, for his pity, for any of the looks she had grown used to. Instead, the rancher leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. The fire in the hearth had burned lower, throwing long shadows across the walls of the rancher's house. Clara sat quietly at the table, her story told, her tears mostly spent. She felt strangely hollow, like someone who had laid down a burden only to realize her arms still ached from the weight. The rancher had listened without interruption, his steady presence as grounding as the chair beneath her. Now silence hung between them, not heavy, not sharp, but thoughtful, as if he were measuring his words with care. "You've carried more than any soul should," he said at last. His voice was low, almost rough, like it scraped against memories of his own. Clara looked up, startled by the tone. She had expected pity or a simple promise of safety, but not this. Something in his eyes mirrored her pain, though it was shaped differently. "You think you're alone in losing everything?" he went on. "But you're not. Loss carves through more of us out here than you'd believe." She tilted her head, unsure if she should ask. His gaze drifted to the fire, the flickering light catching on the lines around his eyes, lines carved deeper by sorrow than by age. "My wife," he said quietly, the words dropping heavy into the room. Her name was Ellen. She was gentle as spring rain, but strong enough to hold this house together while I worked the herds. We were expecting a child, our first, when fever came through. It took her in a week. Took the babe with her. The air thickened. Clara's breath caught. She had not expected such a confession, not from a man who looked carved out of stone. He stared into the fire, jaw clenched. I buried them out back near the cottonwood tree. After that, I shut down. Didn't matter that the ranch had work enough for 10 men. The silence in this house was louder than any storm. For years, I lived with only cattle for company. Talked to the horses more than I did to people. His voice trembled faintly. Not weakness, but the sound of a scar being touched after too long. Clara's chest tightened, a different ache rising now, empathy. "You asked me why I helped you," he said finally, turning his gaze back to her. "It's because I know what it's like to be empty. Different kind of hunger, maybe, but hunger just the same. When Ellen died, I starved for something I couldn't name, and I would have given anything if someone had reminded me I was still worth something. Still alive, still human." Clara's hands trembled in her lap. She understood in a way words couldn't quite hold. Hunger of the belly, hunger of the heart, they both left a person hollow, desperate, ashamed. The rancher leaned back, his expression firm again, but gentler now. "So don't you think for a second you've got nothing to offer. You being here, it reminds me of life, not loss. Reminds me this house doesn't have to stay silent forever." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was no blessing, only a burden. But the way he looked at her, steady, unwavering, without judgment, made the protest die on her tongue. Instead, she whispered, "You must have loved her very much." He nodded once, a shadow of sorrow flickering across his face. "I still do. Always will. But loving what I lost doesn't mean I can't care for what's before me now." The words struck her harder than any she had ever heard. Not because they promised romance, but because they promised something rarer. The possibility of being seen without being used, of being welcomed without a price, and for the first time, Clara wondered if perhaps her story didn't have to end with shame and hunger. Perhaps in the quiet strength of this man who had lost everything, there was a place where her brokenness could begin to heal. The next morning, Clara woke to the soft light of dawn spilling through the small window of the guest room. She lay still for a long moment, disoriented by the simple comfort of a bed beneath her and a roof overhead. The quilt tucked around her shoulders was clean and smelled faintly of cedar. It had been so long since she'd slept anywhere other than under the open sky, curled against hunger and cold, that the safety felt almost unreal. Her stomach, for once, was not twisting in agony. She had eaten, truly eaten, the night before. Yet with relief came a sharper unease, the creeping thought that nothing came freely in this world. She pushed herself upright, bracing for the moment when the rancher would appear at her door with the demand she had been trained to expect. But when she stepped into the kitchen, she found him already at the table finishing his breakfast. He rose politely at her entrance, motioned to the plate he'd set aside for her, eggs, bread, and a cup of milk, and then spoke with a calm practicality that startled her. "If you're well enough today," he said, "there's work here if you want it. Ranch like this doesn't run itself. I could use another set of hands." Clara froze, her breath catching. Work. Not the other thing. Real work. She searched his face for any hidden meaning, but all she saw was steady seriousness. "You'd pay me?" she asked cautiously. "I'd feed you, give you a roof, clothes, a place to sleep. That's fair trade for work, don't you think?" Her throat tightened. No one had ever offered her fairness. Always the bargains were cruel, degrading, twisted. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "I don't know if I can do much." The rancher pulled out the chair for her. "You'll learn. Everyone starts somewhere. Strength comes back once a body's fed. And there's plenty to do that doesn't need muscle. Mending, cleaning, tending the garden." She sat slowly, staring at the plate of food he had set for her. She wanted to protest, to tell him she was only a burden. But something in his voice, the way it carried quiet confidence in her, planted a seed of possibility she couldn't ignore. As the day stretched on, he showed her the rhythm of ranch life. She started small, sweeping the porch, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs with careful hands. Later, he handed her simple sewing, mending a torn work shirt. Her stitches were clumsy at first, but she stuck with it, surprised when the rancher looked at her effort and said, "Good, that'll hold." Those 2 words, spoken without sarcasm, warmed her more than the sun overhead. By evening, Clara's body ached from exertion, but it was a good ache, a living ache. She had contributed even in small ways. As she washed her hands at the pump, she caught sight of herself in the water's reflection, her face still thin, her hair still wild, but her eyes looked different, less hollow. That night, as she helped clear the supper dishes, she whispered, "Thank you for letting me earn my keep." The rancher met her gaze across the lamplight. "You're not charity, Clara. You've got dignity, same as anyone. All you needed was a chance." Her chest swelled with something she didn't quite recognize. Not love, not yet, but respect. Respect for herself, for the first time in a long time. And as she lay in bed that night, exhaustion pulling her into sleep, she realized she had not thought once of offering herself for survival. For the first time in months, she had traded her hands, not her body, for the right to live. The days began to string together like beads on a thread, each one brighter than the last. For Clara, time had always been measured by hunger. Hours stretched endlessly when her belly was empty, minutes devoured by the desperate search for scraps. Now life on the ranch gave her a new rhythm, one that was steady and strangely comforting. She rose at dawn with the rancher, the air crisp and cool, dew still clinging to the grass. The ranch stirred awake slowly, the horses whickering in their stalls, the chickens clucking impatiently for feed, the cattle calling low across the pasture. Each sound carried with it a purpose, a reminder that this place was alive and working. At first, her tasks were small. She gathered eggs, fed chickens, swept floors, and mended worn clothes. Her stitches grew steadier, her hands less clumsy. She learned the quiet pride of standing back from a mended garment or a polished floor and thinking, I did that. I made myself useful today. As the weeks slipped by, her confidence grew. She followed the rancher into the garden, learning when to water and when to wait, how to pull weeds without harming the roots. She practiced mixing feed for the animals, listening carefully as he explained why each creature needed what it did. He never spoke down to her, never laughed when she stumbled. Instead, he gave instructions as though he expected her to succeed, and slowly she began to believe she could. The rancher himself remained steady and reserved, but Clara noticed small changes. Where once his evenings had been spent in silence, now the house carried new sounds, her humming while she cooked, the soft rhythm of her voice as she read aloud from an old book she found on his shelf. Even her laughter, hesitant at first, then freer, as she fumbled a task and he offered a rare, kind smile. The house, once heavy with quiet, began to feel lived in again. She saw it in the way the rancher lingered a little longer at the table after supper, or in the way he sometimes paused at the doorway when she was hanging laundry, as though the simple sight filled something hollow inside him. For Clara, healing did not come all at once. There were nights when she woke sweating, haunted by dreams of the road, of cruel hands and mocking voices. There were mornings when shame returned, whispering that she didn't belong here, that kindness could not last. But the work anchored her. The earth beneath her feet, the rhythm of chores, the steady presence of the rancher, they grounded her in ways she had never known. One evening, as the sun melted into shades of amber and rose over the fields, Clara sat on the porch steps, her hands folded in her lap. She found herself humming an old tune her mother used to sing while kneading bread. She hadn't thought of the song in years, but it came unbidden, soft and sweet. The rancher passed by, pausing mid-step. He didn't say anything, just leaned against the post, listening. When the song faded, Clara felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to make noise." He shook his head slowly. "Don't apologize. This house needed sound again. Your voice, it suits it." Her chest tightened, not with shame this time, but with something gentler, warmer, like the first bloom of spring after a long, hard winter. Each day, she found more of herself in the work. Each night, she rested not as a beggar fearing tomorrow, but as a woman slowly piecing her dignity back together. The hunger that had once ruled her life began to quiet, replaced by a new kind of fullness. It was not yet love, but it was healing, and healing was more than she had ever dared hope for. By the time summer deepened, Clara's days had settled into a rhythm she could almost call her own. The ranch felt less like a stranger's house and more like a place where she belonged. She rose with the sun, worked through the daylight hours, and sometimes even caught herself smiling at small things. The way the barn cat wound around her ankles, the smell of fresh hay, the sound of calves bleating for their mothers. But the world beyond the ranch fence was not blind. Trips into town, though rare, became necessary for supplies. Flour, salt, nails, and sometimes medicine. Clara dreaded them. In town, eyes followed her. Whispers rose like wind through dry grass, too faint to catch every word but sharp enough to pierce her skin. There's that girl again, the one who came out of nowhere. Living up at his ranch, is she? Funny how a woman with nothing suddenly finds herself under a man's roof. Bread doesn't come free. Clara kept her head down, clutching the basket tight to her chest. She felt the heat of every gaze, the sting of every assumption. They didn't know her story. They didn't care to. To them, she was a stray taken in, a burden at best, a scandal at worst. One afternoon, as she left the general store with a sack of flour, two women standing by the doorway fell silent as she passed. Clara caught a fragment of their mutterings. Shameful. Bold enough to walk the streets as if she's respectable. Her face burned and she quickened her pace. When she reached the wagon where the rancher waited, she forced a smile as she handed him the supplies. But her hands trembled, and he noticed. On the ride home, the silence between them was heavy. Finally, he said, "What did they say?" Clara shook her head. It doesn't matter. His hands tightened on the reins. It matters if it cut you. She hesitated, then whispered, They think I'm with you. That I bought my place at your table with more than work. The rancher's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. For a moment, Clara feared she had angered him. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady as a rock against a storm. People talk because they don't know the truth, and sometimes because they don't want to. But let me tell you something, Clara. Their words don't decide who you are. Or who you are to me. She blinked, her throat tightening. But what if they're right? What if everyone believes? She couldn't finish. The shame was too thick, pressing against her chest. He turned his head then, his gaze locking on hers with quiet fierceness. Listen to me. You are not a scandal. You're not a stray. You're not a bargain. You're a woman of worth, and if they can't see it, that's their blindness, not yours. To me, you're the treasure here. Her breath caught, the words striking deep. Treasure. No one had ever called her that. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the strength in his voice, but doubt still gnawed at her. That night, back at the ranch, Clara stood on the porch long after the lamps were blown out. The prairie stretched wide and endless beneath the stars, quiet and unjudging. Out here, the whispers of town could not reach her. Out here, she felt the truth of his words echo in her heart, fragile but steady. She was not just surviving. She was beginning to matter, yet deep inside, she knew the whispers would not stop. And sooner or later, they would test the fragile hope she was building. The whispers of town faded once Clara was back at the ranch, but they lingered in her mind, shadows she couldn't shake. Each time she laughed while working beside the rancher or shared a quiet meal at his table, the echo of those voices returned. Bread doesn't come free, shameful. And then, as if the world itself wished to test the fragile peace she had found. Her past arrived at the ranch gate. It was a gray morning when the wagon creaked up the road. Clara was in the yard hanging laundry when she recognized the hunched figure driving it, a man from the settlement she had fled, one who had known of her desperation, one who had mocked her for begging. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the damp sheet, her fingers stiff with dread. Clara? His voice carried across the yard, sharp and oily, as though he savored using her name. Didn't think I'd find you living in such comfort. His eyes slid toward the porch where the rancher had stepped out. Broad shoulders, rigid, gaze narrowing. Clara wanted to shrink, to vanish into the earth. She had dreamed of this moment many nights. The fear of being found, the shame of her past laid bare. The man dismounted, dust puffing around his boots. Seems you landed on your feet after all, he said with a sneer. Trading one kind of hunger for another, eh? The rancher's hand flexed at his side, but he didn't move. His voice was low, steady. State your business. My business? The man chuckled. Why, only to warn you, do you know what kind of woman you've taken in? A beggar, a girl so desperate she offered herself for bread. Is that what you're feeding under your roof? Each word struck Clara like a blow. Her breath came shallow, her heart hammering. She wanted to scream, to deny, but the truth was tangled in his cruelty. She had begged, she had been desperate. Her shame rose like a tide, threatening to drown her. The rancher didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the intruder, calm but burning. I know exactly who she is, he said. The man blinked, thrown off balance. You do? I know she's endured more hardship than you could stomach in a lifetime, the rancher continued, his voice hardening. And I know she's worth 10 of any man who'd spit on a woman's suffering instead of lifting a hand to help. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the restless stamping of the horses. The man's sneer faltered, his swagger thinning under the weight of the rancher's words. Clara stood frozen, tears pricking her eyes. For so long she had expected abandonment the moment someone uncovered her past. But here, before her very eyes, the rancher stood firm, not turning from her but standing with her. Finally, the man muttered, "Foolishness. You'll regret wasting your mercy." He climbed back onto his wagon, spat in the dust, and turned his horse toward the road. When the sound of wheels faded, Clara collapsed onto the porch steps, her knees too weak to hold her. The rancher came to her side but kept a careful distance, as if giving her space. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why defend me when he's right? I did beg, I did—" Shame choked her. He knelt then, his gaze steady on hers. "Clara, your past is not a chain. It doesn't bind you unless you let it. What you did was survive, and survival is no shame, not in my eyes." Her tears spilled then, but they were not only of grief. They were of release, of something heavier loosening in her chest. For the first time, she believed he might truly see her as more than her mistakes. And in that moment, Clara realized trust was not given once, but tested and proven. And the rancher had proven his. Autumn arrived quietly, with golden leaves tumbling from the cottonwoods and a sharper chill in the morning air. The fields ripened for harvest, and the ranch hummed with the steady rhythm of work. Clara, once a trembling stranger at the door, now moved with confidence. Her hands were calloused from chores, her cheeks sun-warmed, her eyes brighter than they had been in years. The day of her past's intrusion had changed something between her and the rancher. Though he had always been steady, his defense of her had planted a seed deep in her heart, a seed of trust that slowly, steadily grew. And with it came something even more fragile, the possibility of love. Clara didn't name it at first. She only felt it in the way her chest eased when he entered the room, or how her laughter came quicker when he spoke. Though his words were few, she noticed the care in his actions, the extra log on the fire when the nights grew cold, the way he sharpened tools before she used them, the rare but treasured smile when she sang while working. One evening, after a long day of gathering hay, Clara baked bread. She had grown skilled at it, her hands now sure in the kneading, her timing precise. The smell filled the small house, rich and warm. And for the first time since she could remember, she felt proud, not only that she had bread, but that she had made it, that she could offer it. When the loaf cooled, she set it on the table. The rancher sat across from her, silent as always, but his eyes softened as he took his slice. They ate quietly, the fire crackling in the hearth. Then Clara spoke, her voice low, trembling. "Do you remember the first night? When I begged for bread?" His eyes lifted to hers, steady, unreadable. "I remember." She looked down at her hands. "I thought I had nothing to give, nothing worth keeping, and yet you've given me everything." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. "I don't know why. I don't know how to repay it." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then the rancher pushed his plate aside, leaning forward slightly. His voice was soft, but it carried weight. "Clara, you don't owe me anything. What I gave freely. You're not here because of bread, or debt, or pity. You're here because you belong here. You always did, even before you believed it yourself." Her breath caught. She searched his face, trying to read what he hadn't yet said aloud. His gaze held hers, unflinching, honest. Slowly she whispered, "And if I said, I want to stay, not because I must, but because I want to?" A faint smile curved his lips, rare and true. "Then I'd say I've been waiting to hear that." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not born of shame this time. They were born of relief, of joy, of the quiet miracle of being seen, wanted, loved. She reached across the table, hesitant, and his rough, work-worn hand met hers halfway. In that simple touch, a vow passed between them, unspoken yet stronger than any words. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying the scent of earth and harvest. Inside, two souls who had walked long roads of silence and hunger finally found their home. Not in bread, not in labor, not even in the shelter of the ranch itself. But in each other, Clara no longer begged for survival. She no longer traded dignity for scraps. She was not a stray, Not a burden, not a scandal. She was, as he had told her from the beginning, the treasure here, and for the first time in her life, she believed it.